So this is going to be a video that focuses on close reading, but from a specific vantage point. So a lot of videos about close reading can give you a kind of overview of how to read something, annotate it, develop those annotations into larger ideas, and we're going to do something along those lines here. But the idea is, rather than giving you a kind of generic overview of close reading, we'll have like a specific angle here. And so that angle is time, how time factors into literature. And it seems like it's something that should be very simple, but it can actually get kind of complicated. And so if we read something with time in mind, it ends up being a kind of interesting way to focus at least part of the close reading that we can do with a text. And so if you're looking for coming up with discussion questions for a group discussion, if you're looking for coming up with something to write about in a text or in response to a text, this is one way that we can use close reading with a specific focus on time to do that. So what we'll do first is go through a few terms that are kind of like the fancy literary theory terms, and then we'll see how we can take some of those terms and use them to focus some of our thinking and talking and writing. So let's start here with these two terms. When I say time in a narrative, you might be thinking kind of like the setting, like time could be part of a setting. What time period is a story set in? What time of day is this scene in? And those things are all relevant. They're all things that we can think of when we're thinking about time and storytelling and analyzing it. But what I'm going to focus on today is a few terms that have to do with how we order time in a story. So the most obvious way to order a narrative, to order a story, is chronologically. So everything happens in the order that it happens. But as you likely know, storytellers, filmmakers don't always do everything in sequence. So you've seen flashbacks, you've seen kind of visions of the future. In a movie, you might see a character, kind of witness something that will happen to them through some kind of magical occurrence. We have two words for that, just kind of literary terms. Flash forward is prolepsis, and flash back in time is analepsis. And so when we see that happening, that's something that we want to stop, pause, and annotate, ask questions about, and really think, why has the author, the filmmaker, the storyteller chosen to employ these, moves, these narrative moves, where instead of just telling things in sequence, we have to stop the narrative and move back or move forward. So these are two good terms to have. Here are a few more. So in terms of time, we are always thinking about kind of like the structure of the story. So in the previous slide, you see that when we're thinking about flashbacks and flash forwards, we're thinking about them in relation to the sequence of events in a story. One of the key sequences in a story is always the beginning. And so a choice that a storyteller has to make is always, where do we begin? Some people call this the point of attack. I haven't heard this too frequently, but I see it every now and then, and I think it's a pretty good phrase. And the point of attack means, where does the story literally begin? Okay, so it's possible that the first scene is, as you know, where the story begins because it's the first thing you read or the first thing you see in a movie, but the story doesn't really pick up until a few pages in or a few minutes in, when some event happens that propels the character into something dramatic. So a lot of times people call that the inciting incident, but you don't necessarily have to have the first scene be the inciting incident. The first scene is just where the story begins, the point of attack. So for that point of attack, there are three options. And we have these three kind of fancy phrases here. You have ab ovo, in media res, and in ultima res. And it might, again, seem kind of simple, but if we ask, what did the storyteller choose? Which one of these three? And if we determine which one of the three the storyteller chose, we can then ask why. And generally speaking, interesting things come out of that discussion. So ab ovo is beginning at the beginning. I know that sounds kind of like strange. Everything begins at the beginning because then it wouldn't be the beginning. Yes, but think of it this way. Does the story begin kind of like when everything is status quo, when everything is good even, and then a little while into it, something dramatic happens, something terrible happens, something out of the ordinary happens to propel things into kind of a different mode. Some stories begin where things are already dramatic, where the characters are in the middle of a fight, in the middle of something big, and we drop the reader right into the middle of that fray. So ab ovo is you're beginning maybe at kind of like the status quo, and then the drama happens later. In media res is you are throwing them into the thick of things. In ultima res is more rare, but you do see it. You begin at the end. It doesn't necessarily have to be the very, very end, but you start off by kind of spoiling it. So, if you watch the movie Titanic, we know that Rose survives the sinking of the Titanic because we see her as an old woman in the first sequence, and then we flash back to see, the story of the sinking. There are good reasons to do that. We already do know the ending if we're seeing a movie about Titanic because everyone knows that the ship sunk. So maybe it makes sense to acknowledge that, start off in the future, create intrigue, because now it's not just a matter of will the ship sink? We know the answer to that. It's, well, what happened to this person that led her to be where she is in the beginning of the film as an old woman. So you do see these things. But once we acknowledge them, once we can identify them, that's not where the discussion ends. That's where the discussion begins. So this is one of those things that, is helpful if you want to, again, come up with a way to read something closely that's not always following the same pattern. If we focus on these terms and apply them to what we're reading or what we're watching, we can come up with interesting things, interesting questions. So let me give you an example of how this might play out. Famously, The Lion King is kind of a retelling of Hamlet. It's not, a really in-depth kind of serious attempt at just doing Shakespeare with lions. But the story is there, right? So the story of Hamlet is that Hamlet's father is the king of Denmark, that he's murdered by Hamlet's uncle. Hamlet is not there, not in Denmark at the time. When he returns upon hearing of his father's death, he then sees the ghost of his father, who tells him what nobody else knows, which is that his uncle, Hamlet's uncle Claudius, killed Hamlet's father so that he could become king. And he then says basically to Hamlet, you've got to avenge my death and kill Claudius. So that's the Lion King, right? Scar kills the king, Simba's father, in order to become the king himself, and Simba has to return to Pride Rock and take the throne away from Scar and defeat Scar. So that's the story, but let's consider these terms, right? So Hamlet, the first scene famously is where Hamlet sees his father's ghost. So let me kind of play a little bit of that for you. This is the Kenneth Branagh adaptation, and this is Act 1.
Thy father's spirit, doomed for a certain term to walk the night, and for the day confined to fast in fires till the foul crimes
So
done in my...
We don't need to hear all of that, but you get the sense of it. Like, there's his father, he's dead, he's a ghost, he's telling him he's a spirit, and he's going to reveal to Hamlet now, I didn't just die, I was killed by your uncle, and you have to do something about this. So that's the beginning. So if we go back, to these terms, this is really the in media res opening, right? So the murder of the king, that's a big story. That's already happened before Hamlet begins. So when we start, there's already big drama that's happening before Hamlet's real story actually starts. And we're dropped right in the middle of it. The king is dead. And we're learning the kind of secret about it right in the beginning. Now, if you've seen The Lion King, you would know that that is not how we begin, right? So Simba does see the ghost of his father directly from Hamlet, right? This is them referencing Hamlet. But this is towards the end of the movie, about 3/4 of the way in. So let's watch this scene.
You knew my father?
Correction, I know your father.
I hate to tell you this, but he died a long time ago.
Nope, wrong again.
All right, so he actually did die.
He's alive, and I show him to you.
The monkey is
follow
wrong.
Rafiki.
And then he's going to see him as a ghost.
Simba, you have forgotten me.
No. How could I?
You have forgotten who you are, and so forgotten me. Look inside yourself, Simba. You are more than what you have become. You must take your place in the circle of life.
How can I go back? I'm not who I used to be.
Remember who you are. You are my son, and the one true king. Remember.
Okay. So there's obviously a much different tone to this than the Hamlet scene, right? This is more kind of like inspiring and poignant. And the idea is that the ghost, the father, is inspiring the son. There is a similarity though, because when he says take your place as king, he is saying, go get Scar. Maybe don't kill him, but you need to take him out. And so there's a similarity there, but the placement of this 3/4 of the way into the film makes it much different, because this is then kind of like the catalyst that pushes Simba to kind of complete his character arc. But for Hamlet, there's 4 hours of this left after this scene. In The Lion King, there's like 15 minutes. And so if we, again, think of those terms, the Lion King has the ab ovo beginning, right? It begins with Simba being born. It then shows you the king being murdered by the uncle, all of which happens before in Hamlet, right? So Hamlet doesn't begin with Hamlet being born. It doesn't show you Hamlet's relationship with his father. It doesn't show you the murder scene. It begins after all of that. And so what we have here then is a good way to demonstrate why and how these choices make for good analysis. Because what does it do to start the story with the birth of the prince, and to really show the relationship between the prince and the uncle, as opposed to starting the story after the death of the king? And you can see, that, obviously one is for children, but that these decisions affect the whole way that the story proceeds. And so if we think of each story, Hamlet and The Lion King, having very similar events, right? Murder of the king, the uncle takes the throne, the son comes back, the son avenges. Those events are the same. But by choosing where the point of attack is, right, and making it different, that affects meaning. And so that's the key point here, is that we can focus in on these things and identify them in a text, but then we have to ask, well, how does it affect meaning?